my piece of work, as always, is in metamorphosis, despite the Capricorn. I've got afflicting Neptune squares that always do this to me. And so that's been unfortunate for some of you, because my paper started off simply blandly as a title to cover myself, to do with the analysis of divination, which does concern me, and some of the blurbs describe that, and Evan had picked up on a comment from that particular, the metamorphosis of the thing. That does concern me, and I'll just give you a little bit of the scope of my work, perhaps, by saying yes, I am concerned with that. Within that, I became very interested in a particular area just in this year, once studies are tumbling together, and this then led me into the African material. I'm not a specialist anthropologist or an Africanist, so who am I to offer interpretations of the chicane in African divination? But I saw that was a neglected topic as far as I could see. Perhaps some will disabuse me and say there's been stacks of library shelves full of material on the chicane I seem to have missed. This has happened to me many times, this sort of thing. So perhaps I've missed it, but it's important in terms of divinatory practice to look at this in particular. And this will reveal some of the analytic that I'm interested in. It didn't sound a horrible word, analytic, but I'm not scared of it. I do think there's a place for theorising in this area that's very, very important. And if we theorise well, we'll help diviners divine well, and we'll help anthropology widen its scope, will help in many ways. So that's what the Academy can particularly bring, the relevance of appropriate theory, matched and married to and stemming from practice. So now I'm following on in the footsteps of giants here, and I have to admit the way these serendipities occur. It was for me, an utterly ghastly conference in Copenhagen a couple of years ago. The treasure part of it was meeting Philip Peake and Barbara and Dennis Tedlock in terms of the presentations at that conference, and I was walking across a square in Copenhagen one evening in the midst of this dire event, and Barbara explained to me her views on the cognitive continuum, which she's just expounded to you, and that was very interesting and important. Yes, I thought that's it. That's an excellent model for approaching the subject matter, and so I have run with that to quite a degree, and I thank Barbara for that insight. It's a very it comes from work of other anthropologists, I know, but Barbara has summarised it and given it a shape and form and makes it it's got legs as a way of looking at divination. And I perhaps can express that to you. Later on you can come to the bullet points of the chicane, but for the moment let me just go a little bit wider into these more theoretical concerns. I'm a practicing astrologer and diviner, and so it's always concerned me that we bring this back to practice and take it up from practice. And one reason that the cognitive continuum interested me was that I'm interested in studying structures of divination as presentation of omens, omina. And one of my thing that interests me greatly, which led me to theory there, the omen is that which is shown in divination. And what's utterly fascinating here, and I think much neglected, very few scholars in the field of divination studies as such, of which are very, very few, and the classicists I've come across have lost sight of this. Classical studies have lost sight of this in terms of the understanding of omens in Greek and Roman culture. The omen speaks in the case of address. The omen speaks to you. It speaks to you, and you answer in return. That's how the omen speaks. That's the utter difference with the object case. Science speaks to the thing. It does this. I as an it do this. But the omen is always addressative. It's addressed. There is a little scholarship on this, and I've heard recently there is some French scholarship on this that I've got to chase up, and perhaps somebody can help me on this, on the addressative. But this is really fundamental, and this was lost sight of by classic scholars who picked up a certain bias from the Platonic tradition itself, actually, that begins that philosophy, rapidly, Greek philosophy begins to lose the idea of address and moves to the third-person construction of divine reality. But so that's the first great thing, and it speaks the voice of the other. And so all of Philip Peake's work on twinning, the anthropologist's work on twinning, is most extraordinary here. There is the other that is spoken and speaks to you, is actually the very structure of divination, the Omen. Now, I very much agree with Evan about speaking this up and not just getting rooted in subaltern cultures all the time, although we learn from all the experience. I've absolutely learned from the work that's done on African divination, but it's begin to speak this up because something very extraordinary happens to this as you get into highly developed, highly cultured forms of divination, of which obviously astrology is the one that interests me. This is the lead form of divination in European and Indian subcontinent culture. It is the mode of divination. All the others are, in a sense, minor forms that tend to have to borrow astrology's symbolism. It is the form, and it's still utterly powerful with us as a popular consciousness of symbol and myth. It really is so powerful, astrology, in that sense. It really must be taken extremely seriously as a here and now phenomenon by the scholar and by the practitioner and by the anthropologist. I mean, it's diabolical that anthropology isn't studying the nature and complexion of the understanding of the sun signs in the population as an anthropological question of the nature of the definition of human being. It's you know what I mean? I'm pushing the boat a bit, but it's we can't just leave it. It always happens. This isn't a backhanded swipe at the good old Africanist anthropologist. Please accept this. But it does get me when you get academic discourse. It'll talk about practices in Papua New Guinea, or they'll talk about what happened with Xenophon, or what Plutarch might have done. They don't say what the old lady in Balaam is doing right now, and they don't say what, someone in San Francisco is doing with a Qing with his 3 coins right now. That's why the question of New Age is very, very interesting, actually. It's very interesting, highly problematic. But divination is here with us, here and now. So, slide 1. Now on to, are we doing for time? Carry on, please. One of the leads that I got from Barbara on the cognitive continuum, this is Barbara quoted from the man, the Zulu Isingoma Sikambana, and Barbara's quoting from him directly, thanks to Barbara on that particular lead. Sikambana, who was at the time of questioning around 1940, a very old Sangoma, and a singer of the songs of praise, praising. He was an expert in the ways of his tribe, absolute expert, just as Philip has shown, Philip P. Diviners are the carriers of the culture, of their culture, the wisest and the most ethical people in their group, and the most intelligent. So, I'm not trying to assert anything about divination. And Sikambana, Curler says, was very slow. You'd ask him a question and he'd pause, and then he'd tell you. So Sikambana asks, how is divination done? And Sikambana, as Barbara said, gives this amazing structure. There are 3 ways. Through the spirit, with the bones, and with the head. And on that, Barbara correctly saw a complete structure, theoretical model of divination. It's a good one, it really is. Sikambana's absolutely right, because you place it out as Barbara has done. You now produce a cognitive continuum in divination from spirits through head to bones. You can actually, this problem of trying to analyse different forms of divination, you can actually see that different structures of divination in different cultures tend to exemplify or occupy a certain range of that continuum, and its practitioners will give language or voice to part of that continuum, but you get the full spectrum there. And the trained Sangoma knows divination across the whole spectrum and can name the differences. Very few diviners actually do occupy full spectrum in this way. I don't do full trance possession. I do not do spirits singing in the eaves with apparently as if I'm a ventriloquist, they're speaking. I don't do that. No, I do something much nearer this end, the head and bones. Bones is very interesting. Get away from full trance possession and ecstatic possession. Bones and manipulation of objects, this is where the idea of chance arrangements comes in. The shaking of the basket of the bones has a clear pattern to it, and the way you see bones divination, astrology for me is a type of bones divination because it uses the planets then are the bones. And the great key to bones divination is it's non-initiatic itself. So a trained commoner can look over the diviner's shoulder and see, with most of the basket divinations of the Africans, somebody else educated can see if the diviner was cheating, because the basket will actually be producing one of the bones in a forward position. And if the diviner doesn't give a response on that, you'll know that they're cheating. The bones have actually seemed to indicate this. Why isn't the diviner saying it? Same an astrologer. Lilly, trained by Evans, the Welshman in London, William Lilly, looked over Evans' shoulder and could see that Evans was giving a false reading to a client just for commercial gain. That's when Lilly parted with Evans, who taught in astrology. Another astrologer can see an astrologer giving a fake judgment. That's characteristic of the highly inductive, ratiocinative, bones end of the spectrum. But as any of you who are practitioners of divination will know, there are very, very few pure bones forms. The reason I got into the African stuff was I've been studying Evans Pritchard on the Chicane oracle, which is an absolutely pure bones form, in a sense practiced by non-initiates, completely. There's a yes and no answer, chicken die, chicken live, to Krishna's question. And that's comparable to the, there are very few pure forms of bones that have a high place in culture. I mean, flipping a coin, but it's like bones, heads or tails. That's the crudest sort of, if you make that a form of divination, that's absolutely crude. Very rarely do they achieve high status in a culture, but astrology has, in Western civilization. Amongst the Azandi, the Chicane oracle occupied the top status of divination, and for the ancient Israelites, the Urim and Thummim. That's pure bones, and as far as we know, one of the main practices at Delphi could have been bones, something of a similar nature, as well as transpossession by the Pythia. So you can actually look at forms of divination moving across that continuum, but even in the purest bones form, like the very high craft discipline of traditional astrology, high bones form, highly raticinative, it necessarily involves this middle ground, highly interpretive, where symbolic interpretation comes in plus flashes of intuition. That's in the head. Purely in the head divination doesn't even require any manipulation of an object. But I'm particularly interested in the inductive forms down this end. That's the centre of focus of study, this end of things. And matching what Barbara has said, over many years of study of astrologers and astrology, I came to the conclusion you get the same spectrum at work in the act of interpreting a horoscope. You move between speculative, what I've called speculative, and realised modes of interpretation. The realised is where the astrologer get the hit. I see what that symbolism actually means for this client in this particular situation, as opposed to what the textbook says Moon in Leo means. Speculative versus realised. And it's very interesting, the balance of these two structures. And every great tradition of inductive divination requires a full intellectual structure that copes with the speculative, but in order to allow that practitioner to make this move intuitive. Yes,
The voice on high has said that you're allowed to continue with this if you want to, but you don't. Well, quite it.
Well,
That's the chicane.
okay, all right. That's the whole beginnings that you see a theoretical outline of a study of divination. What about the chicane? A ridiculous thing that outsiders and some anthropologists coming to divination, an error they make. Victor Turner made this error, various anthropologists make it. So they think that divination is about an individual data packet of information, and has the diviner successfully passed this piece of information? Well, oh no, he didn't guess this, or I cheated him. You even get some earlier anthropologists who cheat, who lie to the diviner to trick them, and then prove that the diviner hasn't been able to see anything. I mean, what the hell, you know? It's not packets of individual data being passed across. It's a complete process, as has been so established by various of the scholars here, a complete process of dialogue, taking up both parties beginning to come together on it. Now, in the middle of this, I'm very intrigued. You see, right, let's cut to the chase, I'll get to it very quickly. Because it's not packets of information, and it relies, inductive divination, it relies on speculative treatment, I know as a diviner, when I am punting with a client, trying this, trying that, what does that Saturn mean, I think, and I ask some banal questions. And so most astrology dialogues and client and divinity dialogues are banal sort of attempts to elicit information. And then, obviously, if I will be getting cold reading indications as they begin to twitch. As I say something, I'm going to see that. You know, cold reading, for heaven's sake. And I'll make some generalised statements about, I'll see a Saturn, I'll think, well, that must have been depressing. I'll talk about limitations and watch for them to say, oh, yeah, limitation. You see, that's the Barnum effect, you see. Now, it's, and gradually the diviner builds up a picture with the client beginning to engage in the dialogue. And in terms of the ridiculous sceptical critiques of divination, this is all put down to Barnum effect and cold reading. Yes, the point I'm making is one must actually see that is called chicanery, Barnum and cold reading, is in fact is an implicit structure of the divinity dialogue. Now, the reason it becomes very hot potatoes is when you realise, because I became interested in Evans Pritchard's discussion with the witch doctors, and then I read in Eliard's this is the universality of this practice. Witch doctor healing, which is exactly complementary with witch doctor divination, involves stage magician illusion. Psychic surgery all over the world is done by a trick, clever trick. Now, when I say trick, that's the parting of the way. Oh no, it's just an illusion. The whole thing's an illusion. But yes, the witch doctors are very skilled illusionists, and will pull the witch bone out of the suffering villager, who then thinks they've been healed. And that's an explicit and intentional chicane being practiced by the practitioner to induce an effect and an understanding in the patient. And in fact, even Evans Pritchard, who's in a sense insensitive in some ways but a marvellous observer in other ways, even he can see that oddly the villagers are colluding in this. Many of the Azandi know that their witch doctors pull these tricks, but they enter into this performance. One enters into this performance of this act. It's like theatre. And so that's one of the secrets of the initiation of the witch doctors is the chicane, intentionally practiced. And then that leads to the question, what is chicane as opposed to what is we would call real? Because it then turns out the structure of reality itself for the witch doctor has this extraordinary chicane move to it. Different witch doctors will be more literal-minded than other witch doctors, who knows? I mean, I tried to cover that in the current paper that's on the site, believe it or not the one you originally had. It was half a paper, there was a different one anyway. The current one on the site gives a fairly complete statement about this approach to seeing chicane. So, I begin to draw to a close, and then you can come off the bullet points and Lindsay can come back at me. If you look at the implications of this, it's extraordinary. Now, well, extraordinary, there are implications, that's not over-egg it, but one thing I'm going to share with several of you and share, I think, with Evan, so we May and Barbara, we really must, I put it in our language, bullet point, first, the principal argument, bottom one. Divination in all cognitive modes may carry a meta-natural empirical residuum. You see, I do think I'd like to be disabused of this and told of anthropologists who don't fall into this. Even the very good anthropologists with utter sensitivity of their material seem to back away from saying, well, there is an empirical, residual empirical reality to witchcraft. Evans Pritchard says, of course, no man may be a witch. Of course, Evans Pritchard? How do we... What are we saying? In what way can it be real that a man may be perceived to be a witch, the nature of the ill intention or bad mood attaching to somebody in a highly collective culture may not be then registered between us? There's been enough work done on the nature and interaction of human beings to know that this might not be such a daft idea as it might seem. I'm not going to buy into... I'm not a sentimentalist about these things. I do not like a lot of the practices of the African witch doctors or of the Azandi. They're not my practices. I don't want to do them. I'm sympathetic with some of the missionaries who don't like them. I have my culture, they have theirs. But to imagine that they're not actually contacting empirical, residual, meta-natural phenomena is absurd, and in our day and age we should begin to regard this as poor science to be maintaining this. Actually, there's been enough done in the field of just telepathy to establish, except to a bigot, that this is a reasonable phenomenon. If it's a reasonable phenomenon, then a great deal of healing and divinatory practice can be seen as at least bringing out this empirical reality. And then, so you see that I put it in our terms, even to use the word metanatural, that already raises the epistemological problem, the nature of reality. Of course it does. I put it in our terms. But that's why I say these questions begin to touch on the definition of human being itself. They bring us to epistemology and they bring anthropos to ontology. And that's where I do think, you see, anthropology needs to be able to come up to us in what we know of reality and modern practices of divination and begin to reveal and discourse on that. So that's the hope. So I hope that gives you enough of why I brought in Chicane. Right.
Thank you very much. I've got a few points that I'd quite like to engage with you in, but you sound as if you want to sort of test out the anthropologists.
Oh, no, I don't know.
No, my line would be more anthropologists. I'm wondering whether you'd like to go straight to...
Oh, no, please, Lindsay, what's the line?
No, I mean, the lines along which I was thinking, the idea of deception, the whole idea of the game and play and performance, which you brought up yourself,
right,
and this idea of theatre. I mean, with deception, to my mind, the intention is what's critical. I mean, whether it's with malign intent or benign intent, and you brought that up in your paper. But what about the sort of slightly more blurry things? Say, in an encounter with an astrologer, the astrologer says, the client says, how long is this circumstance going on for? And in the astrologer's judgment, it's going to be operative, let's say, for at least 3 years. But she can see that the client is going to completely, who's hoping that you're going to say it's finishing next week, is going to be absolutely demolished by the idea that it's going on for 2 years, blurs it a bit and says, well, maybe to the end of the year, or, perhaps for a few months more, or something like that. In other words, they're actually, within their own craft, a lie, they're making a deception, but they're doing it with the intent of easing the crime. I mean, what do you feel about that sort of...
Right, I think that the chicane, in my view, seems to be turned to a function that is bridging psychospiritual, whatever you call it, reality, the other reality with our world. And so that's the first step. And now then trying to protect the client may or may not be part of that function. The matter is complex, because I'm first seeing the chicane as involved in this strange move between worlds, spirit world and our world. And that's the slight that has to be made to bring the spirits into our world for ordinary consciousness. Now, the question you pose goes to the heart of the ethic of divination, and is is profound, and I can't easily answer you. You will know, Lindsay, we each face this dilemma. This will take us, would be as if we were an astrology conference if I'm not careful, but I've always regretted, when I look back on several major occasions, that I did try and negotiate it because I thought what ought to be good for the client, and I won't say this or I won't say that, and I've regretted that, and I realise I've not done well by the client. So I prefer to trust that if the omen shows, it wishes to be spoken and addressed, and there are ways of doing that and there are ways of doing that. But so I can't answer the problem easily, but the question you pose goes to the ethic of being a diviner. There is no easy answer to it, but one must be fully strung out on that problem. Yes. Will you organise questions, Lindsay? Yes. You choose people, or else I don't see them. Yes.
Critical light. I just want to see critical light so we can see Geoffrey.
Oh no, I mean...
I just wanted to say about the chicane, if it helps, but I just thought it is that we know this when we're doing astrology or divination, that you enter a kind of as-if world, like a myth or story. So thinking about theatre, when you go to theatre, you're looking at it as if it's real, and something real is happening, but you have to kind of enter some other space, which is the chicane's doing that as well. It's saying, what if I am able to draw this bone out of you?
Yes, I think that begins to be closer to the state of mind.
This very concrete, scientifically explained world, to shift into somewhere else where you can draw bones out of people, that's not going to happen in our, but it can shift you there by saying, yes, this is as if.
Right, no, thank you, Pat. Do you mind me using each questioner in this sleight of hand way in order to expound something on what they're about? I'm not going to do that. I was amazed at Everett Picard's description. The witch doctor will kick a bone at you if he doesn't like what you say, and then go across and pluck it out of you and show you the beetle he's just flicks into you. Yes, I'm going to do that, right? Not better because I like the question. Yes. Oh dear, what was the question? Right, what was the central point of the question, Blaine?
To say about the chicane, it isn't just it's an illusion.
The as if. Yes, that's right. I hope you did. Those of you who saw the paper at all in its transmogrified form saw my little exposition on Granny's ring. Which is put very seriously to you. The first major theorist to put these views, really, I would say, in divination, he doesn't put it in these words, or indeed the idea of the address nature of an omen, it really stems from Livy Brawl, who's been a major influence for me, I think, and for some other people in this field. The as-if nature of it. You see, if you take this open mood, the open mode that I give the case of Granny's ring, I call it double thinking, which is a very interesting relation to it. I think a good diviner double thinks, holds together two things, one of which, if pushed to conclusion, would render impossible the other thing. And you do the thing even though possibly it's impossible. That requires a type of intelligence. Now, we astrologers know that as Hermes Mercury. That's why Mercury is a traditional ruler of astrology, magic, and thieves, and language. Every interpretation is an act of theft and a sleight of hand. The diviner knows this. So, yes, it is always to play that as if, and that requires this type of open mind that nevertheless can still act and spring out when it needs to. And I call that double thinking.
We've got a lot of people wanting to ask questions right at that.
Yes. Thank you. I would like to comment your interesting slide on the continuum of the divination.
Yes.
Dimension, and then I would like to come to the oldest information we have. This is in the caves where we have bones of the bear, Ursus Peleus. And these caves in France, they are 33,000 years old. And what is here interesting that we also find such caves where we have both the skull of Homo neanderthalicus as well as the bones of the bear.
Right.
And then when we come to the northern part of Europe, to Finland, Scandinavia, we again find, as early as in Iceland, we find the burned bones of the bear. So spirits, head and bones. I think if we now go to the oldest traces of religion, maybe divination, then we find these burned bones. If the birds were cremated and burned, they were preserved. If they were not burned, they became rotten. So there must be a certain reason to burn the bones. And I think that this bear, the ancestor, was maybe divine, and that may be one of the oldest expressions in the archaeology of the human mind, where we can find some traces of divination.
Thank you for that. Now, you're talking, therefore, with a specialist knowledge that obviously is beyond mine, and I appreciate your observations there, because from my readings in African divination, the Sangoma, or the witch doctor, in their initiation, the animal that sacrificed was a white goat quite often. The bones, some of the bones of the white goat that's being sacrificed to the other animals in other cultures are nevertheless kept as part of the medicine bones of the diviner, and that's very important because that was the bone that was of the offering for his or her initiation, and that bone, then the bone of the animal's initiation is then used, and so that for the bare bone to be used in a ritual offering and burnt and then kept as a ritual object makes complete sense to me in the way these things make sense. Yes. Lindsay, please.
Very briefly, Jeff, you have argued for the rightful place of the chicane in the divinatory process. Now, to my mind, you could go two ways with that. One of them, and which I think would be unsatisfactory ultimately, would be to say that the only point of the chicane or chicanery, that it really is trickery, and the only point of it is in some way to allow a true divinatory moment to occur. Now, you could take that if you want. But it seems to me that the other way, which is, wilder and therefore more interesting, I think, at any rate to consider, is that the chicane or chicanery is actually an essential part of the moment of divination.
Yeah.
And the way I can imagine that happening is because chicanery is the trickster or Hermes. Mm. And when the diviner engages in chicanery, is not he or she assuming the mantle of the trickster?
Yes.
Or of Hermes in order to divine?
Absolutely. No, I absolutely agree with you, Patrick. That's the I think the true understanding of the chicane, because certainly with all the inductive divinatory forms, using the I Ching or using a pack of tarot cards, one is putting together incommensurables. You're putting together incommensurable orders. This is the ultimate metaphor that is what I'm making. Now, to do that is an act of high consciousness, it's utter poetry to do this, an act of complete intelligence and faith that it shall be so. It's a complete faith in the nature of reality that it will show, in the ultimate as if. In every other sense it is absurd. So yes, that's why Hermes is the god of these, Metis intelligence, and Hermes, and the trickster figure, the threshold figure, is the cunning fox. These are the images of divination.
Do you want to take Laura's, or
you do some selection? Yes.
Yes, I'd like to take up the fourth bullet point on your list of principal arguments.
Oh dear.
Psychospiritual reality. And I think it's true enough to talk of the trickster and Hermes, and that's very familiar ground that we know as diviners. But I think there's something more subtle and complicated in the nature of psychospiritual reality, which we miss if we start to name it simply as Hermes. And this is what I'd like to ask you about in this sense, that the way I've understood it from your paper, it takes us back to the nature of what the witch is and what witchcraft is. A person falls sick because witchcraft has been done to them by a witch who might not even know that they have made such an act, because a person falls sick from a witch through a bad thought. So the fact that the witch doctor is curing a sickness which has been put upon someone who doesn't know it's been put upon them by a witch who doesn't even know that they've made the bad thought, already takes us into a psycho-spiritual realm that the wise witch doctor knows. So if he is to cure it, he's already curing on a psycho-spiritual dimension.
Yes.
But the sick person doesn't know that. So it reminds me of the 4 levels hermeneutic, that the sick person and the community have to see the bone being taken, have to see the literal level of the healing. But the far more subtle level, where even the witch doctor realises that it's not the removal of the bone, it's the witch doctor phlegm or whatever, the medicine that is curing it, and the medicine itself is not a real earthly medicine, it's a psycho-spiritual realm medicine, because only that will address a sickness that comes unconsciously and is given unconsciously, received unconsciously.
Can I leave off? There's so much to leave off. Yeah, can I leave off that? Yes. Yes, Maggie, as you know, the matter is subtle and subtle beyond subtle. And one begins to realise that very experienced witch doctors are subtle beyond subtle beyond subtle. And the naivety of approach sometimes to imagine that we have the categories that can lay this out, extraordinary naivety of approach, and that gets me about certain attitudes in modern scholarship, not at all represented here, that have this. And one of the subtle beyond subtle beyond subtle, I'm very interested, in Maggie's referred to, in using hermeneutics from other areas. So I think the Christian fourfold hermeneutic of early medieval Christianity is a beautiful exposition of divinatory form. And one begins to look at the Church Fathers and their treatment of the nature of revelation and the nature of the Bible, and you see subtle upon subtle upon subtle. Nowadays we're taught not to see any of that. We don't see that, even in our own mystery tradition of Christianity, we don't see it. So subtle upon subtle upon subtle, and in fact the Church Fathers knew this. You must not say that it's not the actual bone being taken out or the physical medicine. So it is that as well. That's double, triple, quadruple, multiple thinking, where the witch doctor, of course, he knows he's actually Chicane, sleight of hand, the witch bone or the beetle or the blood. He's produced it. And he also knows that is the healing as well. Such is the nature of magic. It's not that we can hardly comprehend in a post-enlightenment attitude what that means to have that type of openness to phenomena where it's all those things at once, because we make an over-precise divide between literal and symbolic. Post-Cartesian thought has divided the literal and the symbolic, but in fact, if you go back to pre-Enlightenment thought, including Christian thought, you will find a recovery of that subtlety of understanding that takes the literal also as absolutely literally real, the body of Christ, really, really so, says the Christian, really so, and knows it symbolically, tropologically, allegorically, anagogically, mystagogically, you see, all those things. That's why it follows what Evan says. There's a next stage of divination scholarship in Montreal that begins to move up through the later mysteries and see how divination evolves into very subtle forms of astrology and magic in the Renaissance, and with Chinese civilization, the I Ching, which is unsurpassed as having this capacity to take up multiple real and not lose the literal. A wonderful possibility, and so begin to move up the scale. So, thank you, Maggie, for that, allowing me to come up with that.
Yeah, just real quickly, I've much appreciated your acknowledgement of your process in divination, because it reminds us of the name of the conference, which is what was so attractive to me. It's Divination and Dialogue. And I think what we miss so often in the divinatory enterprise is the dialogue that follows the revelation, the oracular message, and the exchange that takes place. There's a colleague of mine working in Mozambique talks about divination is only the starting engine. And that maybe kind of reminds us it's a way to get going on something. Yes, there may be a tremendously important embodied message, but every divinatory enterprise has that process of exchange and dialogue and discussion and debate involved in it. It's not either or, it's not absolute, it's not a fixed message. It's something to be worked with. Appreciate you bringing that up.
Yes, so can I thank you, Philip, because that allows me to bring it up yet again, you see, and emphasise it. That's the great thing about this, isn't it? On this addressivity of the Omen, the work is only done just as the person's only healed when they're really healed and jumping around for joy, and they know the witchcraft has gone out of them because the witch doctor succeeded. The Omen is truly achieved when you have listened, when the one who's gone to the diviner has listened and heard and been moved and said, yes, that's my story. You see, it's most important. It's no good the diviner sitting there omening away and receiving all the messages and secrets of the universe. What's the use of that? It really is and in fact the whole ethic, and this comes out from Philip Peake's work and the other anthropologists he works with, the whole social and ethical nature of this, that the diviner is there to serve the whole tribe or the whole group, and is giving this to, giving it for them, and this is the culture that it is alive in this very act of giving and being taken up. It's yes. So thank you, Philip, for that. It's
what I most appreciate is your thinking about double thinking and the critical nature of this trickster-like activity that diviners are often involved in, and incidentally witches too, especially those witches are put spectacle on display. The spectacle is exactly that, something that is held up to view, meant to be seen, to be believed, because what's being made visible is what is otherwise invisible and manifest, and that there's something about the nature of all human thinking that is literal and plotting and needs to be seen to be believed. But these are dynamics that are real, but unless they're manifest, somehow escape our own capacity to be attentive to. So I very much like that part of your paper, and drawing on the trickster. It's not so much the trickster as mediator, but opening all kinds of possibility for allowing that kind of double think in the client or the patient as well as the diviner. Now, in the African case, all these things, as you pointed out, are as subtle as anywhere. So I was troubled by a kind of irony in your presentation and your paper, especially in the presentation today, in that you're calling for study of divination in the here and now, the very actual manifestations here and now, but that you return to very old and classic work of E. Evans Pritchard and Colin and Levy Gould, who are not of our day and age in anthropology or anywhere else. And I think are the kinds of thinkers who are very caught up in the kinds of thinking that you're finding problematic. And so I feel like you've set yourself a trap that, and would encourage, therefore, to turn to thinking that's more contemporary in this regard, and it doesn't set African divination, for example, as something so different, so primitive, and then put things on the scale from primitive to modern and complex, that would say that, Eugene, when astrology surpasses those other forms. Because I think what's most interesting is the way in which there is consonance among all these practices along the lines of the kinds of things that you're tracing, double thinking and moving from the literal even through the literal.
Right. You got a lot of points in there, Laura, no, very important points, and I'll try and address, I might not address satisfactorily all that you said there. There's a whole issue, the history of anthropological thought, I must be careful about. I'm not a great expert in it. In my small lights, put it like that, I still think that what Levi-Broad said hasn't yet been thought through. A thinker can actually begin to lay down markers that the implications of which are even obscure to the thinker themselves. Certainly the case of Levi-Broad. Nearly everybody, I know, I've read a lot about the criticisms of Levi-Broad. You see, Evans Pritchard started off, he tries to deconstruct Levi-Broad in his great work. A lot of the time he's fighting with the early Levi-Broad. And Evans Pritchard doesn't even pay heed to the notebooks, the late Levi-Broad, where Levi-Broad acknowledges the misperceptions that arise from the rigid way he put his own categorization. So Levi-Broad's an enormously subtle thinker himself. And with subtle thinkers of this nature, I'm not convinced that they go in and out of fashion, but it's not necessarily so that they've been thought through, the implications. I still really haven't come across treatments of the participation mystique that outstrip fundamentally the formulations that Levi-Broad gave us. His work on the nature of number and things of this nature, they're still, I would have thought, of prime importance. And with Evans Pritchard, yes, Evans Pritchard shows that I find him a tremendously honest scholar. I can read him and I can see where he's coming from, and he has clear biases, but he seems to me to make an incredible intellectual effort with the material to such an extent that I can begin to read the material. I mean, so there aren't that many really, really good people who've studied in the field of divination that we can sort of ignore them, you see. So I still find Evans Pritchard, I'm still trying to do a lot of work on understanding what he's making of the Chicane Oracle. It's immensely important because it's illuminated for me a whole particular issue of Bone's divination. Now, there aren't many ethnographers who give you the material in that sort of depth with that sort of thought. So even his struggles and his failures are illuminating. And the same with Levi-Broad. So I don't regard them as old-fashioned, but I'm willing to be enlightened by whatever the new generation is that has thought beyond or thought through. I mean, Laura, you tell me, or Philip can tell me who are the ones who I therefore should read. You see, I wish to be educated. So that would be my answer to you there. There are other things you were saying of great importance. I probably haven't got time to cover them, but no, thank you for what you said, because it's...
And I look forward to that work. Pulling forward what they have done that brings them into...
Still trying to cope with what they've said, it's fair enough. Yes, it's...
Geoffrey, we've got about 5 minutes more. So
you choose.
A simple question. I feel a little like an outsider as opposed to an insider. You made one point about the value of integrating what is absurd and random in a divinatory act. And I saw several folks here say, And so I was... Could you say a little bit more about how that works in terms of this divinatory mindset, this hermetic mindset, the role of what's random, and how does that function in this act of
Wow, Greg. Hang on. Yes,
Maybe it's not a simple question.
it's not a simple question at all. Great. And I might not be connecting correctly with what you want to ask, but I'll try to, because the issue of what we call randomness, is it palliatory or something, randomness, it's tricky because it often gets seized upon as a primary way of defining the field of divination. It's very much a procedure at the bones end of the spectrum of divination, but no way is spirit possession. It doesn't answer to that category satisfactorily. So randomness or chance, you have to try hard to make the transposition fit into that model of divination. So something else is going on. What we call randomness in the bones procedures does appear to be a method of breaking the hold of a discursive, of a pattern of expectation. You break, and therefore the other world can show itself. We do understand that. That gets overemphasised in the discussion of divination, in my view. It's being given too much priority. It's only part of the procedure. Now, on the absurd, much trickier. I don't know how I can expand much beyond that. It's that there's something about our construction of thinking that will be faced with an impossible paradox by this material. Now, is that to do spiritually with us and our civilization, post-Descartes or not? I don't know. It might be. There's something about this material that will run you up against the wall of an immense paradox, and that's why I use coded guard words like meta-natural brackets, because we don't even have the language within which to lay out the problem or the question of such phenomena. We do not have the language. Modern parapsychology and psychoresearch have stumbled. They haven't found the language for laying out the question. So there's no answer to be given to it. We're faced with something that gives you an absurd phenomena, cutting across expectations. So we diviners, as Omen readers, will look at the silliest thing happening and charge it with significance, like, Angela with her emails and things. It's not a little thing, but we'll give weight to a slight thing that in the chain of events might seem inconsequential, and one has read it as an omen. Now, for most common sense people in our society, that is absurd. Omen reading is absurd, yes. Yes.
Geoffrey,
we ought to, yes.
There were other hands up, so you can go over into tea time.
Yes, we can have a cup of tea face to face at tea, yes.
Thank you.